This is a recorded lecture for Chapter 22, the Digestive System. This is for the Anatomy and Physiology Class 230. Thank you very much. We'll begin from there. The digestive system is really two groups of organs, and it's important to understand that as we go through the process, as we identify them. We have the organs that make up the alimentary canal, or the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract. There are all those terms. And then we have, what they do is they digest and absorb food, and they include the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. That's really the first group. The second group are what are called accessory digestive organs, and they're the organs that are not part or identified in the alimentary tract. They include the teeth, the tongue, and the gallbladder, because the gallbladder is associated with, or actually provides bile to the digestive process, and the digestive glands, which include the salivary glands, the liver, and the pancreas. It's the liver and the pancreas that provide a plethora of enzymes and other products, bile, if you will, for the liver and on down the line, provide a plethora of enzymes that help to break down proteins and carbohydrates and fats and all of that, and it's pretty spectacular. When we look at the alimentary canal, or the GI tract, we start at the oral pharynx. The oral pharynx then goes to the laryngeal pharynx, and then to the larynx, where the world of the digestive system and the respiratory system separate, and posteriorly the food goes down the esophagus. The esophagus actually enters the stomach a little to the right and below the top of the stomach, called the fundus, if you will. And there's a little sphincter that allows the food to pass down, but hopefully prevents the food from coming up. A lot of people have trouble with that sphincter, and it's called the lower esophageal sphincter. You'll also hear the term cardiac sphincter because it's an old term. This is the body of the stomach right here. This is the pylorus of the stomach, and there's a pyloric valve at the end of the stomach. The pyloric valve opens up into the first step, the first part, if you will, of the small intestine, and that's called the duodenum. The duodenum is where a great deal of digestion takes place and absorption takes place. The next part of the small intestine is the jejunum, and finally the ileum. At the terminal end of the ileum, inserts, if you will, into the ascending colon, or the large intestine. It does that through a valve called the ileocecal valve, which is a one-way valve, which allows the chyme, or the breakdown product of food, to move in one direction from the small intestine, the ileum in this case, into the large intestine, and the little outpouching here at the end is called the cecum. At the end of the cecum is what's called the vermiform appendix. As I said, the ileocecal valve opens. It allows the food to pass to the large intestine. That's the ascending colon. There's the transverse colon, the descending colon, and then a little S colon, called this part of the colon called the sigmoid colon, and finally the anal canal and the anus proper. That's really the tract that for food is transferred, if you will, or transmitted into poop. There are 6 essential activities in the digestive process. They include ingestion, the propulsion of the food, a mechanical digestion, the actual grinding up of the food, a chemical digestion, where chemicals and enzymes are brought into the chyme, the mixture of the food, and help break it down chemically, absorption of the nutrients, and then finally defecation of the after products. This takes you to that same process that tells you what's going on here. You get ingestion here. You have mechanical digestion, which is chewing or churning the stomach, and segmentation in the small intestine, which kind of helps to move it. You have propulsion, so you have swallowing in the oral pharynx. You have peristalsis in the esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine. Then you have absorption into the bloodstream as well as the lymph vessels. We'll talk more about that later. And finally, you have defecation, where the part that we don't use is brought from our body. Peristalsis and segmentation are often mixed up, but we have to kind of get a feel for what that means. Peristalsis means adjacent segments of the alimentary tract organs alternately contract and relax, which helps to prepare food or propel food down the tract. That's peristalsis. Segmentation is when non-adjacent segments of the alimentary tract tract organs alternately contract and relax, moving the food forward then backward, and that mixes the food up. Segmentation doesn't really move the food in a direction, it kind of churns it, where peristalsis is the goal is to move the food in a given direction. The regulatory mechanisms for the GI tract include the mechanoreceptors and the chemoreceptors. They respond to stretch, changes in osmolarity and pH, and the presence of a substrate and the end products of digestion. They initiate reflexes that activate or inhibit digestive glands or stimulate smooth muscles to mix and move the lumen contents. We also have intrinsic and extrinsic controls. We have enteric nerve plexuses, the gut brain as it's called, which initiate short reflexes in response to stimuli within the GI tract itself. So it's inherent to the GI tract. We have long reflexes in response to stimuli inside or outside the GI tract, which involve the central nervous system centers and the autonomic nerves. And then we have hormones from the cells of the stomach and the small intestine, which help to stimulate target cells of the stomach or the small intestine, or in different organs altogether. This gives you a feel what we're talking about. You have an external stimuli, so you see food, you smell food, you taste food, or you have a thought of food, which sort of tells the stomach, or tells the brain, it's time to eat something. And the brain then initiates a whole lot of changes which cause the GI tract to want to eat. It starts to get started. It gets the saliva started in your mouth and starts to get acid to build up in the stomach and all sorts of things. We talk about the peritoneum and the peritoneal cavity. The peritoneum is clearly the serous membrane of the abdominal cavity. We talked about it before. It has two layers, a visceral and a parietal layer. The visceral layer is the part that is intimately touching and surrounds the organs, and the parietal peritoneum is the one that lines the walls of the abdominal pelvic cavity. The peritoneal cavity is between the two peritoneums, the two visceral and parietal peritoneums. And there's a fluid inside between the two of them that helps to lubricate so that as organs move, there's less friction. Here gives you a nice feel for the visceral and the parietal peritoneum. You can see this is the organ proper, so there's the canal. There's the part of the peritoneum that actually touches, and then you see the parietal peritoneum, which doesn't really touch the organ proper. It never does. And you get kind of a feel for, as we're talking about, what happens. The mesentery is really a double-layer peritoneum, and it serves as routes or routes for the blood vessels, lymphatics, nerves, and it also helps to hold organs in place and stores fat. We also have organs behind the peritoneum that actually sit outside of the peritoneum posteriorly, and that's called the retroperitoneal area. They are called the retroperitoneal organs, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. We have intraperitoneal or peritoneal organs, which are all surrounded by peritoneum, and those are the ones that are located anteriorly in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And so retroperitoneal means behind the peritoneum, and you can see that. Where intraperitoneal or peritoneal means that it's actually inside of the peritoneum proper. The blood supply to the digestive system is through the splenic circulation. The arteries include the hepatic arteries, the splenic arteries, and the left gastric arteries, also the inferior and superior mesenteric arteries. The hepatic portal circulation drains the rich blood from the digestive organs and delivers it to the liver for processing. So there's a benefit there because that's a method that we actually absorb some of our nutrients. We talk about the tissue, if you will, or the histology of the alimentary canal. There are really four basic layers, and they're called tunics sometimes. You have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa, and this is from inside to outside. As we look at this cutaway of tissue, what you'll see is the inside, you'll see that mucosa inside layer. You'll see the submucosa, and the submucosa is the next layer out, which holds the glands and all of that. And then we have the muscularis externa. The muscularis externa includes the longitudinal and the circular muscles, if you will, that help to move the food through peristalsis. And finally, the outside is really connective tissue called the serosa, and it sort of holds the serosa, if you will, kind of holds everything in place, and it also provides a mechanism to hold the blood vessels next to the blood vessels and the arteries and the veins. The arteries, veins, and lymph glands, lymph vessels next to the GI tract proper, the alimentary tract proper, so that they can enter and exit as they need to. The most inner layer is the mucosa. It lines the lumen of the alimentary tract, the inside. It helps to secrete mucosa, and digests enzymes and hormones, and absorbs end products of digestion. It also helps to protect against infectious disease. There are 3 layers. There's the epithelial layer, epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. Do not mix this up with the muscularis externa. The epithelial layer is a simple columnar epithelium, and that makes sense because there are mucus-secreting cells, which are probably goblet cells. And there's mucus, they secrete mucus, and that protects the digestive organs from enzymes, and it also helps to ease food passage to the GI tract. The epithelium may secrete enzymes and hormones in the stomach and the small intestines. The lamina propria is a loose, areolar connective tissue. It has capillaries for the nourishment and absorption of nutrients. It has lymphoid follicles, part of the NALT system we talked about before. And then we have the muscularis mucosa, which is that smooth muscle that produces local movements of the mucosa. So not the mucosa, not the muscularis externa, but a part of the mucosa. The next layer out is the submucosa. It's a dense connective tissue. It's rich in blood and lymphatic vessels and lymphatic follicles, and it provides or holds the submucosal nerve plexus for the GI tract. And then there's the muscular proper layer, muscularis externa. It's responsible for segmentation as well as peristalsis. The inner muscularis layer is circular. It essentially works in the circumference of the GI tract proper. Then there's a longitudinal layer on the outside that goes down the tract longitudinally, and between those two, they're able to commit this segmentation and peristaltic process. They are innervated by the myenteric nerve plexus, and there's sphincters in some regions of that which will help to resist backflow of the contents. The serosa is really visceral peritoneum. It's replaced by a fibrous adventitia in the esophagus, but it's really visceral peritoneum. The retroperitoneal organs have both an adventitia and a serosa, because that's just inherently what they have. And we've already talked about this before, so I won't go through this slide again. We talk about the enteric nervous system. The intrinsic nerve supply of the alimentary canal is really supplied by the submucosal nerve plexus. It helps to regulate the glands and the smooth muscle in the mucosa, and the myenteric nerve plexus actually controls that GI tract motility, or the movement of fluid, movement of stuff through the GI tract. The enteric nervous system is linked to the central nervous system via afferent visceral fibers. The long autonomic nervous system fibers synapse the enteric plexuses, and the sympathetic impulses inhibit secretion or motility, and the parasympathetic impulses stimulate secretion and motility. That makes sense. Sympathetic wants to shut down the GI system when you're in a fight or flight situation. The parasympathetic wants to make the GI tract work better, harder, faster, if you will, so we can absorb better. We're talking about the organs of the GI tract. The first is the mouth. It is essentially the buccal cavity, as it's called. It's bounded obviously by the lips, the cheeks, the palate, the hard, soft palate, and the tongue. And the oral orifice is the anterior opening in your mouth, if you will. It's lined with stratified squamous epithelium, interestingly enough. And so there's the oral pharynx. You get the nice feel for the oral pharynx, the tongue, if you will. You get the soft palate, the hard palate. We've already talked about all that before, and you can see how that goes. The lips of the cheek contain the orbicularis oris, is the lips, the buccinator muscles of the cheeks. The vestibule is the recess internal of the lips and cheeks, and it's external of teeth and gums. The oral cavity proper lies within the teeth and gums, so you got to know that. And the labial frenulum is the median attachment of each lip to the gum. So if you take your tongue and you go up in front of your teeth, you'll see a little kind of attachment that holds the lips, if you will, and it's called the labial frenulum. You have one at the bottom and one at the top. And this is a nice look at an open mouth. You can see the gingiva, which is the name for gums. You can see the hard palate, if you will, and it goes down the soft palate. There's the uvula, see the tongue proper. There's the lingular frenulum, that's the attachment that holds the tongue in place. And then you see the openings for the submandibular ducts, if you will. Again, more gingiva or gums. And you see the inferior labial frenulum of the lip. You see the superior labial frenulum of the upper lip. So you kind of have a feel for what we're talking about. The vestibule is that space between the lips and the teeth proper, and you kind of feel for what we're discussing. The palate is the hard palate, the soft palate. The hard palate is obviously the palatine bones and the palatine process of the maxillocranial bone. It's slightly corrugated to help create friction against the tongue. The soft palate is a fold formed mostly of skeletal muscle, and it closes off the nasopharynx during swallowing, and the uvula projects downward from its free edge, so it kind of sticks down and hangs out there. The tongue functions in several ways. It helps to reposition and mix food during chewing. It helps to create the formation of bolus for swallowing. It helps the initiation of swallowing, speech, and taste. The intrinsic muscles change the shape of the tongue, and the extrinsic muscles alter the tongue's position. You can stick out your tongue or move it around. Excuse me. And then, of course, as we talked about before, what you're going to see is the lingual frenulum, which attaches to the floor of the mouth and kind of holds the tongue in place. And interestingly enough, when this is too short in children, that's what they're called tongue-tied, and they have to go in and they have to snip that frenulum to allow their tongue a little more flexibility. The tongue surface bears papillae, and they can be filiform or fungiform or circumvallate or foliate. The filiform are whitish, you give the tongue that roughness and provide friction. The fungiform are reddish, scatter over the tongue. The circumvallate, sometimes called a villate or a V-shaped row in the back of the tongue, and these house these three house the taste buds. So all of these really have the taste buds attached to them. The foliate are on the lateral aspects of the posterior tongue. The tongue has terminal sulcus marks the division between the body and the root. The body is the anterior 2/3, residing in the oral cavity, and the root is the posterior third, residing in the oral pharynx. And when you look at the tongue proper, you see the epiglottis here. Get a nice feel for the lingual tonsil, if you will. The palatoglossal arch, you kind of feel for that. There's that terminal sulcus we talked about. There's the foliate papillae, circumvallate papillae, and finally the midline groove, the dorsum of the tongue, fungiform papillae, and the filiform papillae. The salivary glands are extrinsic salivary glands. They are made up of the parotid, the submandibular, and sublingual glands. The salivary glands, the intrinsic buccal salivary glands, are scattered in the oral mucosa. So we go back. We have extrinsic salivary glands, the parotid, mandibular, and the sublingual. And we also have intrinsic salivary glands, the buccal glands, which are scattered in the oral mucosa. They provide secretion of saliva, which cleanses the mouth, moistens and dissolves the food and chemicals, aids in the bolus formation for swallowing, and it contains enzymes that begin the breakdowns of starches, essentially carbohydrates, into simple sugars. The extrinsic, if you will, the external glands are the parotid gland as being the first. It's anterior to the ear, external to the masseter muscle. The parotid duct opens into the vestibule next to the second upper molar, so in the cheek, if you will. The submandibular gland is medial to the body of the mandible, and its duct opens up at the base of the lingual frenula. Finally, the sublingual gland is anterior to the submandibular gland under the tongue. It opens via 10 to 12 ducts in the floor of the mouth. And again, you can see that right here. You get the ducts of the sublingual gland. You get the sublingual gland right here as it opens up into there. There's the submandibular gland located below the mandible. And finally, the big old parotid gland, which is actually the largest of the salivary glands, which is located just anterior to the ear. And it opens up into the cheek proper almost. The composition of saliva is secreted by the serous and mucous cells. It's about 97 to 99.5% water. It's slightly acidic, but it contains electrolytes to include sodium, potassium chloride, phosphorus, and bicarb. It contains salivary amylase and lingual lipase to break down starches. It has mucin in it. It has metabolic waste to include urea and uric acid. It contains lysosome, IgA antibodies, defenses, and a cyanide compound that protects against microorganisms. Yes, a cyanide compound. Not a cyanide compound that hurts us, but a cyanide compound. Control of salivation. Intrinsic glands continuously keep the mouth moist. Those extrinsic salivary glands produce secretions when ingested food stimulates the chemoreceptors, the mechanical receptors of the mouth. The salivary nuclei in the brain stem send impulses along the parasympathetic fibers to the cranial nerves 8 and 9. And there's a strong sympathetic stimulation which inhibits salivation and results in dry mouth called xerostomia. The teeth. We talk about the teeth. There's primary and permanent dentations, which are formed by age 21. We have 20 deciduous teeth, which erupt between the ages of 6 to 24 months of age. The roots are resorbed, the teeth fall out, and at 6 to 12 years of age, as the permanent teeth start to develop. We have 32 permanent teeth, and all except the third molars erupt by the end of adolescence. And this is a nice x-ray of the teeth. You can see the deciduous teeth as they're going to fall out, and the permanent teeth are the ones that have the permanent roots. We have classes of teeth. We have incisors, canines, premolars, sometimes called bicuspids, and molars. The incisors are chisel-shaped for cutting. The canines are kind of like the fangs, the vampire fangs, if you will, that tear or pierce. And the premolars, or bicuspids and molars, have broad crowns with rounded cusps for grinding and crushing food. And you get a feel for what we're talking about. There's the incisors. The central incisor, if you will, begins at 6 to 8 months. The lateral incisors you see at age 10 months. The canines are the eye teeth, they're called sometimes, are 16 to 20 months. The first molar is 10 to 15 months, and the second molar is about 2 years. And then you kind of get a feel for what we're talking about. When we talk about the permanent teeth, the incisors, they come back in about year 7. The laterals are 8. Canines are 11. Premolar bicuspids, if you will, or first premolar is 11. Second premolar is 12 to 13. The molars, the first molar is 6 to 7 years. Second molar is 12 to 13 years. And the third molar, sometimes called the wisdom teeth, occurs at 17 to 25 years, or erupts. Dental formula is a shorthand way of indicating the number and relative position of teeth. It's the ratio of upper to lower teeth for one half of the mouth. The primary is 21 1C 2M, and the permanent is 21 1C 2PM 3M. How does that work? Well, that's just a way of describing them. It's just a method that dentists use to describe those teeth. Crown is the exposed part above the gingiva of any tooth. It's covered by enamel. It's the hardest substance in the body, made up of calcium salts and hydroxyapatite crystals. The root is the portion embedded in the jaw. And so the root is below the gum, and it's connected to the crown by the neck. The neck is the place where the gum and the tooth intersect. So the line the gum makes is really the neck, if you will, or the neck of the tooth. The cementum is the calcified connective tissue that covers the root and attaches it to the periodontal ligament. The periodontal ligament forms the fibrous joint called a gomphosis, which we talked about. We talked about joints before. And then we talked about gingival sulcus, which is the groove where the gingiva borders the tooth. The dentin is the bone-like material under the enamel, and it's maintained by odontoblasts of the pulp cavity. The pulp cavity is the cavity surrounded by dentin, and the pulp is connective tissue which contains blood vessels and nerves, and the root canal extends from the pulp cavity to the apical foramen of the root. And this kind of looks at all that as we look. There's the apical foramen of the root, and you see that it enters as the nerve starts to leave. There's the bone around it. There's the crown. That's the part that's above the gum. At the point where the gingiva, if you will, comes in contact with the tooth proper, that's the neck. And the part that's located below the gingiva is really the root. Get a really good feel for the outside enamel. There's the dentin. There's the dentinal tubules. There's the pulp inside, which contains the blood vessels and nerves. There's and we talked about the gingiva. There's the cementum at the outside. There's the periodontal ligaments there. So you get a nice feel for looking at the tooth proper. We talk about tooth and gum disease. We have to talk about dental caries or cavities, which is really a breakdown of the enamel and the dentin of a tooth. Dental plaque, sugar, bacteria, and debris adhere to the teeth, and the acid from the bacteria dissolves those calcium salts. They have proteolytic enzymes which digest the organic matter, and the way to prevent that is obviously daily flossing and brushing. Gingivitis is really an inflammation of the gingiva, of the gum. The plaque calcifies to form a calculus or tartar. The calculus disrupts the seal between the gingiva and the tooth, and it allows anaerobic bacteria that live in with a zero oxygen or low oxygen area, to infect the gums, and the infection is reversible if the calculus is removed. Periodontitis is where immune cells attack intruders in body tissues and destroy the periodontal ligament, and they activate the osteoclast. The consequences are possible tooth loss, promotion of atherosclerosis, and clot formation of the coronary and cerebral arteries. Believe it or not, periodontitis, if you will, can promote a heart attack. We're talking about the pharynx, the oral pharynx, the laryngeal pharynx allow passage of food, fluids, and air. They are lined with stratified squamous epithelium, and the skeletal muscle layers, they intervene longitudinal outer pharyngeal constrictors. The esophagus is a flat muscular tube that extends from the laryngeal pharynx to the stomach, and it pierces the diaphragm at the esophageal hiatus. It joins the stomach at the cardiac orifice. You'll hear cardiac sphincter, and you'll hear LES, lower esophageal sphincter. The esophageal mucosa contains stratified squamous epithelium, and it changes to simple columnar at the stomach. The esophageal gland is submucosal, in submucosa secretes a mucus, taking bolus movement, and the muscularis has the skeletal superiorly and the smooth muscle inferiorly, and it has adventitia instead of serosa surrounding it. Great cross-section of the esophagus. You see the mucosa is located inside. It contains a stratified squamous epithelium. There's a submucosa, which is the areolar connective tissue. There's the lumen, the opening of the esophagus. You see the muscularis externa, which contains the longitudinal and circular layers of muscle, and finally the outside adventitia layer, which is the fibrous connective tissue. This is a micro picture, if you will, a picture microscopy of the mucosa, and it contains that stratified squamous epithelium we talked about. We talk about the mouth, the digestive processes. It's really responsible for several things: ingestion of food, and mechanical digestion, that is mastication, or the chewing of food, is partly voluntary and partly reflex. So we don't think about chew once, twice, 3 times. We could do that, but we also we could chew without thinking about it. We also have chemical digestion in the mouth, where the salivary amylase and lingual lipase start to break down the food. And then we have propulsion, and that's the swallowing. We have degglutination, where we have swallowing, the bolus of food. Degglutination involves the tongue, the soft palate, the pharynx, the esophagus, and 22 muscle groups. There's the buccal phase, where it's voluntary contraction of the tongue, the pharyngeal esophageal phase, which is involuntary, and the control center is in the medulla and the lower pons of the brainstem. And this takes you to that process of how that food is swallowed, and I would really walk through that in your book. Again, you can look at it here. You'll see the upper esophageal sphincter is contracted during the buccal phase. The tongue presses against the hard palate, forcing the food bolus in the oral pharynx, where the involuntary phase begins. The uvula and the larynx rise to prevent food from entering the respiratory passageways. The tongue blocks off the mouth. The upper esophageal sphincter relaxes, allowing the food to enter the esophagus. The constrictor muscles of the pharynx contract, forcing food in the esophageal inferiorly. The upper esophageal sphincter contracts, closes after entry, so it closes off, so it's in a regurg, if you will. The food is moved to the esophagus, to the stomach by peristalsis. And you see that eventually it gets to the esophageal sphincter. You'll hear also the term lower esophageal sphincter, or you'll hear the term cardiac sphincter. Has all those names. The goal is to prevent the food from closing, the sphincter closing, to allow this high acid content from regurgitating or washing up into the esophagus proper. And that takes you to that process. The gross anatomy of the stomach is, it has a cardiac region, which is called the cardia, which surrounds that cardiac orifice, or the lower esophageal sphincter area, where it inserts. The fundus is a dome-shaped region beneath the diaphragm and sits above the insertion of the esophagus. Then we have the body, which is the mid-portion of the stomach. The pyloric region is made up of the anther, the pyloric canal, and the pylorus. And the pylorus is continuous with the duodenum through the pyloric valve. So the pylorus actually is the last part of the stomach that attaches to the duodenum, and there's a valve that separates the two of them called the pyloric valve. It has a greater and lesser curvature. The greater curvature is the outside surface of the stomach. The lesser curvature is the inside surface of the stomach. You'll get a feel for that now. There's the lesser curvature, the inside curve. There's the outer curvature. There's the cardia, there's the esophagus muscularis, if you will, and you get a feel for that. Inserts just to the right and to just inferiorly to the fundus of the stomach, which sticks above it. You see the serosa right here. You see the muscularis. You see a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer. The stomach has 3 layers, which give it more flexibility in grinding up food mechanically. You see the rugae, which are rough areas in the stomach, which help to mechanically break down and rough up the food. There's the body of the stomach, the fundus, the body of the stomach. You see the pyloric area of the stomach. There's the pyloric canal. There's the pyloric sphincter right here, and there's just the beginning of the duodenum. So you get a feel for how we're talking about the stomach. The stomach, the lesser omentum, is from the liver to the lesser curvature, and the greater omentum drapes from the greater curvature anterior to the small intestine. And this gives you a feel for that. There's the falciform ligament, which holds which separates the 2 lobes of the liver. The gallbladder, which sits just underneath the liver. There's the spleen, which is the left upper quadrant. There's the stomach located here, mostly in the center of the abdominal pelvic cavity to the superiorly. There's the ligament teres, if you will. There's the greater omentum, small intestine, and there's the part of the cecum. As we look at this this artist rendition, if you will, we can see the liver right here and the gallbladders. We pull the liver back. You get a feel for the lesser omentum located right underneath there. There's the stomach, and there's the duodenum as it comes down. There's the transverse colon, small intestine is located here. There's the cecum, where the insertion of the ileocecal valve and where the appendiform or the appendix is, the veriform appendix. And there's the urinary bladder located below all of that. The NS supply of the stomach, the nerve supply of the stomach through the autonomic nervous system is sympathetic via the splenic nerves and the celiac plexus, and parasympathetic via the vagus nerve, which is one of the cranial nerves. The blood supply comes out of the celiac trunk and the veins in the hepatic portal system. There are 4 tunics to the stomach, which we talked about. The muscularis and mucosa are modified. The muscularis externa has 3 layers of muscles instead of 2. Has an inner oblique layer, which allows the stomach to churn more readily, mix and move, and physically break down that food. This takes you to those layers. We've already talked about them. You can see the longitudinal, circular, and oblique layers, which help to make that happen. And it takes you to the layers of the stomach proper, from the surface epithelium and down on down. The mucosa is a simple columnar epithelium which is composed of mucus cells, and the layer of mucus traps the bicarbonate-rich fluid beneath it. It has gastric pits, which lead into the gastric glands. And you get that feel now. There's the surface epithelium mucus cells. There's the gastric pits as they open up, and you can see those pits right there. There's the mucus neck cells right there, parietal cells, the chief cells. We'll talk more about that as we go along. The cell types include the mucus neck cells, which secrete a thin acidic mucus, the parietal cells, the chief cells, and the enteroendocrine cells. The H cell producing parietal cells, the pepsin secreting chief cells are located in the gastric mucosa. You get that feel right there. And there's the chief cells, and there's the enteroendocrine cells. The glands of the fundus of the body produce most of the gastric juice, and the parietal cell secretes hydrochloric acid. The pH of the stomach usually approaches 1.5 pHs, which is pretty acid. It can be as high as 3.5, but helps to really denature protein in food and activates pepsin and kills many of the bacteria. Has an intrinsic factor also, which is glycoprotein, which is required for absorption of vitamin B12 in the small intestine, so it will be used later. We also have chief cell secretions, and they inactivate enzyme pepsinogen, activated to pepsin by hydrochloric acid and by pepsin itself. So it's a positive feedback mechanism within the stomach. We have enteroendocrine cells. They secrete a chemical messenger into the lamina propria. They include paracrines, which are serotonin and histamine, hormones, which include somatostatin and gastrin. The mucosal barrier is a layer of bicarbonate-rich mucus. It has tight junctions between the epithelial cells, and damaged epithelial cells are quickly replaced by division of stem cells. So it really is trying to keep that barrier in place. We have some homeostatic imbalances. We have gastritis, which is inflammation caused by anything that breaches that mucosal barrier. Peptic or gastric ulcers is the erosion of the stomach wall, and most are caused by a bacteria. We used to think of a lot of other things, but we found out that most of them are caused by Helicobacter pylori, and there are tests we can do for that now. There's that gastric ulcer, and this is a electron microscopy of a Helicobacter pylori bacteria. Digestive process in the stomach, there's a physical digestion and a denaturization of the protein. There's an enzyme digestion protein by pepsin and rennet in infants, and then which secretes an intrinsic factor required for absorption of B12. A lack of intrinsic factor results in pernicious anemia because you have no B12 within the body. And it delivers the chyme, the food that's been churned up, to the small intestine via the pyloric valve. The regulation of gastric secretion is neural and hormonal. Stimulatory and inhibitory events occur in 3 phases: cephalic, gastric phase, and intestinal phase. The cephalic phase is a few minutes prior to the food entry. The gastric phase lasts about 3 to 4 hours after the food enters the stomach. The intestinal phase is a brief stimulatory effect as partially digested foods enter the duodenum, followed by inhibitory effect, the enterogastric reflex, and the enterogastrones. And this takes you to that whole process, and then really take a look at that in your book. There are regulations and mechanisms of hydrochloric acid secretion. There are 3 chemicals: acetylcholine, histamine, and gastrin, which stimulate parietal cells through a secondary messenger system we talked about many times before. All 3 are necessary for maximum hydrochloric acid secretion. And histamine's blockage to receptors and decrease the hydrochloric acid release. And this talks about that. You can see that process through here. There's the blood capillary. You get a feel for the chief cell, which actually produces that hydrochloric acid we talked about. Response to stomach filling, the stomach stretches to accommodate incoming food. There's a reflex-mediated receptive for relaxation, which is coordinated by the swallowing center of the brainstem. The gastric combination of plasticity, the stress relaxation response of the smooth muscle, helps to make that happen. The gastric contractile activity, the peristaltic waves move towards the pylorus at a rate of about 3 per minute. There's a basic electrical rhythm, BER, which is initiated by pacemaker cells called the cells of PHGY. The distension in gastrin increase force of contraction, and it's much more vigorous near the pylorus of the stomach. The chyme, the churned up food, if you will, is either delivered in 3 millimeter spurts to the duodenum or forced backward in the stomach for rechurning. And you can see how that works. There's the pyloric valves closed, propulsion of periostatic waves move from the fundus towards the pylorus. The grinding, the most vigorous peristalsis and mixing occurs at the pyloric area. And finally, the retropulsion, which may push things back the pylorus into the stomach, acts as a pump that delivers small amounts of chyme into the duodenum, but simultaneously forcing most of its contained material backward the stomach for yet more churning. As the chyme enters the duodenum, receptors respond to the stretch and chemical signals. The enterogastric reflex and the enterogastrones inhibit gastric secretion and duodenal filling. And the enterogastric reflex is interesting. If you ever notice that when little kids get up to eat dinner and they start to eat a few bites, they immediately have to go poop. And the reason that is because there's a gastrocolic reflex which says, I'm eating something, I need to poop. We override that as we get older, we start to control it, but it's an interesting phenomenon. The carbohydrate-rich chyme moves slowly to the duodenum, and the fatty chyme remains in the duodenum 6 hours or more. So carbohydrate-rich chyme moves faster, the fatty chyme moves slower. This takes you through all that process, so you can go to that chart if you like. Small intestine, the gross anatomy, is a major organ of digestion and absorption. It's between 2 and 4 meters long, and it runs from the pyloric sphincter to the ileocecal valve, where it inserts into the large intestine, more specifically the ascending colon. It has 3 parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And the duodenum is mostly retroperitoneal, so it's not surrounded by the visceral or the parietal peritoneum. The jejunum is attached posteriorly by the mesentery, and the ileum is attached posteriorly by the mesentery. This takes you to the tract we've already talked about, and you get a feel for what we did before. The duodenum, the bile duct and the main pancreatic duct actually join and open into the duodenum proper, and they join at what's called the hepatopancreatic ampulla, or the opening in the duodenum. They enter the duodenum at the major duodenal papillae, and they're controlled by the hepatopancreatic sphincter, which allows it to escape. And here's what's interesting. There's the liver, there's the gallbladder, there's the bile duct and sphincter, if you will, and you see where it intersects with the pancreatic duct. Now, where gallstones become a problem, which are really bile stones, they come down. If they come and block this right here at this point of the common duct before it enters the duodenum, what can happen is not only does it push the bile back in and there's no digestion, but it puts all these enzymes back into the pancreas. When the pancreas starts to backflow, it starts to sweat out those enzymes. Some of those enzymes are used to break down proteins. So when it starts to sweat those enzymes and break down proteins, the whole organ system is made up of proteins. So basically what happens is you start to digest yourself. The increased surface area, the proximal part of the nutrient absorption, it has circular folds called, we're talking about the duodenum, which called the plicae circularis. They're permanent. They're 1 centimeter deep, and they force chyme to slowly spiral through the lumen. It also has villi and microvilla on the villi. So there's villi and microvilla. Here's that nice small intestine. You can see the same 3 layers we talked about, or the same layers we talked about before. There's those lumen, if you will, or circular folds inside. There's the villi, and you see a little microvilla, which are like little hairs located on each villi. And basically that's to help with absorption and absorb more, create a greater surface area and absorb more nutrients faster. The villi are multi-finger-like extensions. They're about 1 millimeter high of the mucosa. The villus epithelium is a simple columnar absorptive cells, or enterocytes, and you'll see goblet cells also. The microvilli are projections or brush borders of the absorption cells, and they have brush border enzymes which help to break down certain foods. The intestinal crypt epithelium are made up of secretory cells that produce intestinal juice, and the enteroendocrine cells. Also the intraepithelial lymphocytes, IELs, which release cytokines that kill infected cells. The Paneth cells, which secrete antimicrobial agents like deficits and lysosomes, and finally stem cells are located there. This takes you through all that process. Look at the villi and the microvilli. The submucosa, the next layer out, has Peyer's patches, which protect the distal part against bacteria, and the duodenal Brunner's glands of the duodenum, which secrete this alkaline mucus, which helps to, if you will, break down some of the acid contents that will come out of the stomach. The intestinal juice is secreted in response to distension or irritation of mucosa. It's slightly alkaline and isotonic with the blood plasma. It's largely water, enzyme poor, but contains mucus, and it facilitates transport absorption of the nutrients. The liver. The liver is literally the largest gland in the body. Say that fast 3 times. The liver is literally the largest gland in the body. It has 4 lobes, the right, left, caudate, and quadrate. The falciform ligament separates the large right and the smaller left lobes and suspends the liver from the diaphragm and anterior abdominal wall. The round ligament, or ligamentum teres, is the remnant of the fetal umbilical vein along the free edge of the falciform ligament. Liver proper, you see the bare area. There's the left lobe, there's the right lobe of the liver. See the gallbladder's there. There's that round ligament, so you get kind of a feel for what we're talking about. Looking at the underside of the liver, you see the lesser omentum here, the left lobe of the liver. the porta hepatica or porta hepatis, which contains the hepatic artery and the hepatic portal vein. There's the quadrate lobe of the liver, the ligamentum teres right here. You see the gallbladder located right there, the right lobe of the liver, the bile duct, as it were, and the hepatic vein. So you kind of have a deal for what we're talking about. We're talking about the liver proper. The liver associated structures has a lesser omentum, which anchors the liver to the stomach. The hepatic artery and vein are at the porta hepatis, which provide the circulation, and the bile ducts, which are made up of the common hepatic duct, which leaves the liver, the cystic duct, which connects to the gallbladder proper, and the bile duct formed by the union of both two ducts. The bile duct is the place where the common hepatic duct and the cystic duct come together. So you get kind of a feel for that. So here we go. Here's the bile duct comes down. There's the cystic duct, and then you see the common hepatic duct, hepatic duct right here. So you get a feel for what we're talking about. Then there's the bile duct, which is where those two come together inferiorly. The liver lobules are hexagonal structures and functional units. They filter and process the nutrient-rich blood. They're composed of plates of hepatocytes, which are liver cells, and they have a longitudinal central vein. This looks at the lobule. You get a feel for that central vein located there. The portal triad at each corner of the lobule is the bile duct receives bile from the bile canaliculi, and the portal arteriole is a branch of the hepatic artery. The hepatic venule is a branch of the hepatic portal vein. So the portal arteriole is a branch of the hepatic artery, and the hepatic venule is a branch of the hepatic portal vein. There are liver sinusoids, which are leaky capillaries between the hepatic plates, and the Kupffer cells, hepatic macrophages in the liver, which help to phagocytize foreign material in the liver proper. And this takes through that process, this artery rendition. We talk about hepatocyte functions. They process blood-borne nutrients. They store fat-soluble vitamins. They perform detoxification, and they produce about 900 mils of bile per day, almost a liter per day. The bile is yellow-green. It's alkaline. It contains bile salts, which are cholesterol derivatives that function in fat emulsification absorption, so it allows us to break down fat. They contain bilirubin, which is a pigment formed from heme, or the breakdown product of red blood cells, hemoglobin. And it contains cholesterol and natural fats, phospholipids, electrolytes. The enterohepatic circulation recycles the bile salts. The bile salts go to the duodenum, the urea sold from the ileum, hepatic portal blood, and the liver, and then secreted back in the bile system. The gallbladder is a thin-walled muscular sac on the ventral or undersurface of the liver. Its job is to store and concentrate the bile by absorbing the excess water and ions. It does not produce bile. It stores bile. It's a storage sac. It releases bile via the cystic duct, which flows into the bile duct and ultimately down to the hepatopancreatic duct. The pancreas. The pancreas is mostly retroperitoneal, which is a problem because it's located where the other things that are retroperitoneal include the duodenum, part of the esophagus, part of the aorta, and the kidneys. And so if the pancreas is retroperitoneal and it starts to develop pancreatitis and it starts to ooze those pancreatic juices that break down proteins, guess what it breaks down first? The esophagus, the aorta, the kidneys, you get the idea. So it's mostly retroperitoneal. It's deep to the greater curvature of the stomach. And its head is encircled by the duodenum, and its tail butts to or is next to the spleen. The pancreas has an endocrine function. It has pancreatic islets, which secrete insulin and glucagon. It has an exocrine function, and it has acini, which are clustered secretory cells, which secrete pancreatic juices. Then it has zymogen granules, the secretory cells, which contain digestive enzymes. This looks at the small duct. There's the acinar cells, if you will, the basement membrane, zymogen granules, and there's the rough endoplasmic reticulum as we look at that. Pancreatic juice is watery, alkaline solution, has a pH of approximately 8, which helps to neutralizes the chyme. The primary electrolyte located in pancreatic juice is really bicarb. The enzymes it contains include amylases, lipase, nucleases, in active form, but they require ions or bile for optimal activity. It also secretes proteases, which are secreted in the inactive form. The protease activation occurs in the duodenum, where trypsinogen is activated by trypsin by brush border enzymes enteropeptidase. Procarboxypeptidase, wow, say that past 3 times, and chymotrypsinogen are activated by the trypsin. This takes you to that process, gives you an idea if there's a duodenum, opens up, and you get a feel for how that's broken down. Regulation of bile secretion. Bile secretion is stimulated by the bile salts in the enterohepatic circulation. Secretin from the intestinal cells is exposed to hydrochloric acid and fatty chyme. The gallbladder contraction is stimulated by cholecystokinin, CCK, from the intestinal cells, which is exposed to proteins and fat and chyme. There's also vagal stimulation, which is kind of minor. Remember, that's from the cranial nerve, the cranial nerves. The cholecystokinin, if you will, also causes the hepatopancreatic sphincter to relax and allows discharge of both bile and the pancreatic enzymes and breakdown products. CCK induces the secretion of enzyme-rich pancreatic juice by the acini. Secretin causes secretion of bicarbonate-rich pancreatic juice by the duct cells. And the vagal stimulation also causes the release of pancreatic juice, but again, only to a minor degree. This takes you to the whole step, if you will, and I'm going to walk through this as you go. We'll take when you look at the slides on in your book. Digestion of the small intestine. Chyme from the stomach contains partially digested carbohydrates and proteins and undigested fats. The requirement for digestion absorption in the small intestine, there's a slow delivery of a hypertonic chyme. Hypertonic meaning that it's very concentrated. There's delivery of bile, enzymes, and bicarbonate from the liver and pancreas, and there's a mixing process that occurs. Motility in the small intestine, there's a segmentation process which is initiated by the intrinsic pacemaker cells of the small intestine proper. It mixes and moves the contents slowly and steadily towards the ileocecal valve. The intensity is altered by long and short reflexes, and it wanes in the late intestinal fasting phase. There's the microvilli, and it absorbs the cells we talked about. Motility of the small intestine, the peristalsis, initiated by motilin in the late intestinal phase. Each wave starts distal to the previous, the migrating motility complex, and the meal remnants, bacteria, and debris are moved towards the large intestine. There's the peristalsis we talked about. You can move the bolus down. The local enteric neurons coordinate the intestinal motility, and the cholinergic, that is the cholinergic sensory neurons, those neurons which use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter, may activate the myenteric plexus. This causes contraction of the circular muscle proximally, the longitudinal muscles distally, and forces chyme along the tract. The ileocecal sphincter, or ileocecal valve, relaxes and allows the chyme from the ileum of the small intestine to enter the large intestine, or ascending portion of the large intestine. The gastroileal reflex enhances the force of segmentation in the ileum, and the gastrin increases the motility of the ileum. The ileocecal valve flaps closes when the chyme exerts a backward pressure, so it prevents backflow, if you will. Large intestine has many unique features. It has a tinea coli, which are 3 bands of longitudinal smooth muscle, the muscularis. It has haustra, which are pocket-like sacs caused by the tone of the tinea coli. And it has epiploic appendages, which are fat-filled pouches of visceral peritoneum. It has several regions: the cecum, which is the part that's attached to the vermiform appendix, as well as the ileocecal valve, the colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. You see this as it goes through. There's the ileum as it inserts into the cecum, the ileocecal valve. There's that vermiform appendix off the end. We have the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon. The ascending colon moves from the right lower quadrant to left upper quadrant, and it has a flexure right by the liver called the hepatic flexure. It crosses transversely, it flexes again downward, and that's called the splenic flexure left upper quadrant where the spleen is located. At a certain point, it becomes kind of an S, or the sigmoid colon, finally the rectum, the anal canal, and finally the food is defecated. The colon, the ascending colon, descending colon are both retroperitoneal, interesting enough, and the transverse sigmoid colons are anchored via the mesocolons or the mesentery, so they are not retroperitoneal. This talks about how they look. This takes you through that process. Get a feel for what's retroperitoneal and what's not. You can see this how things are outlined, if you will, what's located posterior or retroperitoneum and not. Next comes the rectum and anus. The rectum has 3 rectal valves which stop feces from being passed with gas, which is good. The anal canal, which is the last segment of the large intestine, and finally the sphincters. We have an internal, external anal sphincter. The internal anal sphincter is made up of smooth muscle, and the external anal sphincter is made up of skeletal muscle, which means the external sphincter is voluntary, the internal sphincter is autonomic or not voluntary. This takes you through that process. There's a rectal valve. There's the rectum proper, there's hemorrhoidal veins, and it takes you through there and finally at the anus, if you will. These are anal columns called the crypta morgani, as a matter of fact, believe it or not, located right there. You get kind of a feel for what we're talking about. The large intestine of microscopic anatomy includes mucosa, a simple columnar epithelium except in the anal canal, which is stratified squamous. It has many, many deep crypts and goblet cells and superficial vein plexuses of the anal canal, which form the hemorrhoids if they're inflamed, so that's where they come from. The bacterial flora enter from the small intestine or the anus. They colonize the colon. They ferment indigestible carbohydrates. They release irritating gases, or release irritating acids and gases. They also synthesize B-complex vitamins and vitamin K. Truly, if you do not have bacteria in the colon proper, you would not be able to have vitamin K, which helps in coagulation, and you would eventually develop what's called megacolon. The colon would get larger and larger until it was dysfunctional completely. Functions of the large intestine include the absorption of vitamins, water, electrolytes. The major function is propulsion of feces towards the anus. The colon is not really essential for life. If part of the colon has to be removed, then the function can be appreciated somewhere else along the line. The motility of the large intestine include what are called haustral contractions, which are slow segmenting movements. The haustral sequentially contract in response to the distension. The gastrocolic reflex is initiated by the presence of food in the stomach. It activates 3 or 4 slow, powerful peristaltic waves per day in the colon, causing mass movements. And that's a gastrocolic reflex I talked about before that children don't have very good control of, but you start to develop control as you get older. Defecation is mass movements of the residual food and chyme, which is forced into the rectum. Distension initiates the spinal defecation reflex. There are parasympathetic signals which stimulate the contraction of the sigmoid colon and the rectum and relax the internal anal sphincter. It's the conscious control which allows relaxation of the external anal sphincter, so you have control of what's going on. This takes you to that process. There's distension or stretch in the rectal walls through the movement of feces into the rectum, which stimulates stress receptors there. The receptors transmit signals along the afferent fibers and the spinal cord neurons. A spinal reflex is initiated in which the parasympathetic motor afferent fibers stimulate contraction of the rectal walls and relaxation of the external anal sphincter. Finally, if it is convenient to defecate, the voluntary motor neurons are inhibited, allowing the external anal sphincter to relax so that feces may pass. Chemical digestion is both catabolic, enzymatic, and hydrolytic. We talk about chemical digestive absorption of carbohydrates. We'll first talk about digestive enzymes. They go from the salivary amylase, pancreatic amylase, and brush border enzymes, which include dextrinase, glucoamylase, lactase, maltase, and sucrase. Absorption is a secondary active transport or co-transport with sodium. It's facilitated diffusion of some of the monosaccharides, which allow them to enter the capillary beds of villi, which are transported to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. This takes you to that whole process. Here's a couple things to think about. The multisaccharides come down and become disaccharides, which is lactose, maltose, sucrose. It's through the effect of lactase, maltase, and sucrase enzymes, which break those down into galactose, glucose, and fructose, which make them absorbable by us. Enzymes, chemical digestion absorption of proteins. Enzymes include pepsin in the stomach, and then pancreatic proteases, which include trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase. We also have brush border enzymes, which are aminopeptidases, carboxypeptidases, and dipeptidases. It's the absorption of amino acids which is coupled to active transport of sodium. So let's go back. So what we talk about here is we want to get to the monosaccharides, the simple sugars, because that's how we absorb them, that's how we use them. In proteins, we want to get down to the amino acids. The amino acids that are the building blocks that we use. We cannot use proteins in any form until they are broken down to amino acids. And this takes you to that process of breakdown to amino acids. Finally, this is protein digestion. You see protein is large polypeptidases, broken down into smaller polypeptidases, and finally to amino acids. And these are the enzymes that are involved. This is the organ that they come from. Chemical digestion absorption of lipids. There's a pre-treatment, which is emulsification of bile salts. You really don't break down fat into smaller molecules. It just really breaks them down into smaller pieces. The way to see that is if you if you open up your kitchen sink and you see you have oil flowing in the kitchen sink. If you put a little dish soap in, it'll start to break down the dish soap so that the oil, instead of floating all together, starts to break down into smaller pieces. There are also enzymes which are pancreatic lipase, which help to break down fats, and then absorption of glycerol and short-chain fatty acids, which are the building blocks that we use. That's the actual breakdown product that we need to absorb, and they're absorbed in the capillary blood and the villi, and they're transported via the hepatic portal vein. The absorption of monoglycerides and fatty acids follow. They cluster with bile salts, and lessen to form what are called micelles. They're released by micelles to fuse in the epithelial cells. They combine with proteins to form what are called chylomicrons. They enter the lacteals and are transported to the systemic circulation. Remember, lacteals are part of the lymphatic system. This takes you to that process, and you can see how those are broken down. This goes through fat. You see you start with unemulsified fats. There's a bile involvement, if you will. There's a liver, small intestine involvement. And the goal is to get down to glycerol and fatty acids. We talk about enzymes. We have pancreatic ribonuclease, and deoxyribonuclease. And then we have absorption, which is active transport, which is transported to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. So this is the breakdown of nucleic acids through enzymes and absorption, enzymes via the pancreatic ribonuclease and the deoxyribonuclease, and absorb that active transport to the hepatic portal vein. And this takes you to that process of nucleic acid breakdown. We talk about vitamin absorption. The small intestine, the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, are carried by micelles and then diffuse into the absorbing cells. The water-soluble vitamins, vitamin C and B vitamins, are absorbed by diffusion or by passive or active transporters. Vitamin B12 binds with intrinsic factor and is absorbed through endocytosis. In the large intestine, vitamin K and B vitamins are taken from the bacterial metabolism in the gut and are absorbed into the bloodstream. We talk about electrolyte absorption. It's mostly along the length of the small intestine. Iron and calcium are absorbed in the duodenum. Sodium is coupled with absorption of glucose and amino acids. Ionic iron is stored in the mucosal cells with ferritin. Potassium diffuses in response to osmotic gradients within the GI tract, and calcium absorption is regulated by vitamin D and the parathyroid hormone, if you remember, that manages that process of blood calcium. 90% of water is absorbed in the small intestine by osmosis. The net osmosis occurs whenever a concentration gradient is established by active transport of solutes, and the water uptake is coupled with that solute uptake. Malabsorption nutrients, malabsorption nutrients, so the causes are anything that interferes with the delivery of bile or pancreatic juice that damage the intestinal mucosa through bacterial infection. You can have a gluten-sensitive enteropathy, celiac disease. You'll hear celiac sprue disease sometimes. The gluten damages the intestinal villi and brush border, and is treated by eliminating gluten from the diet. By the way, that's almost impossible in today's society. So people that have to be on a gluten-free diet because of celiac disease or celiac sprue are really, really limited in what they can and can't eat. It's really interesting. If you ever want to see, just look at go down the aisle of any shopping, any grocery store, and you'll find that gluten's in almost everything. We talk about cancer. The stomach and colon cancers really have early signs or symptoms. The metastasized colon cancers frequently cause secondary liver cancer, and prevention is regular dental and medical examination, believe it or not. All right, so we've just gone through Chapter 22 of the digestive system. Thank you very much.